So first, before sharing the message, I just need to acknowledge how odd this is. I mean, it's hard, but it's also strange, because one of the great gifts for me in preaching is I do get to see your faces, responses. There are people who answer my questions. So there's that sense of the give and take of community, and that's one of the ways God's still speaking with me. So to share a message without that is odd, weird. So I miss you. But I'm thankful for this opportunity to have virtual community, and hopefully with some of you at 11, more in-time community. It's also odd to pre-record a sermon, because every single day or even hour there's a new headline or a new something, so there's this anxiety about what might happen between the time of this recording and the time you're seeing it. But we're going to trust that it's going to be okay, and if there's things we need to catch up on, we can do that at 11 on Sunday with a Zoom meeting. So we've been talking about the reign of God, or for some people, kingdom of God is the language they're used to, that it's at hand. And in this time and place, it can be hard to imagine that it's at hand. We have so much more access to imagining the awful things, the difficult things, the tragic things, the scary things that all feel very at hand. But I want to invite you to take a moment when you think about the reign of God, when we pray each week, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." We're just going to pause for a moment. I invite you to imagine, to tap into a sense of vision about what would that look like if the reign of God was at work here and now. So I'm just going to pause for a moment, give you a sense. Imagination is a powerful spiritual tool. Imagine the reign of God at work here and now. What might be different? What might you feel? So in this season, as we've been talking about throughout Lent, the reign of God, some reminders, or those who weren't with us, we talked about the creation story, how that gives us a picture of how God works in the world, that there's the chaos, that God separates the stormy, chaotic waters from the waters, and out of the chaos brings forth creation, word that fills the emptiness, and that God creates life abundant and diverse and evolving and changing, and human beings who are in God's image, who are co-creators with God, stewards of this creation. God says, oh, that is very good. That God's intention from the beginning is a very goodness. We also, though, have stories that remind us that in every moment, God is not reigning as a dictator. God is not authoritarian. That this is relational and invitational, the way of God's reign. And so humans can and do choose life apart from that reign. We can choose DIY life, do-it-yourself life. And in the theology and the stories, there's this understanding that the chaos, the storms, the God energy makes the way through the storms, that God converts the chaos into new creation. So when we're living disconnected from God and who we are as God's beloved in God's image, disconnected spiritually, emotionally from one another, the notion is that then the chaos seeps back in. The creation comes undone. The things get churned up. That there's a flood of brokenness and pain and hurt. And then we see in the stories that there are different responses to that undoing and that storminess. And if we think of the current storm around coronavirus and the panic and the different ways people are responding that feel so chaotic and scary, that we're aware of that reality. And that often what we sometimes do in the midst of that chaos and storminess is we try to control and manage it. And last week we were talking about that response, how then it's like the waves are coming at us and we try to push them off of us. But then all that storminess usually flows onto someone else. It doesn't go away. We're not converting the energy into something good. We're just trying to shove it away. And then all of that chaos and storminess goes often to the people who are most vulnerable, who are on the margins and the edges. And how Israel had a way to describe that, which was the same as their word in Hebrew for Egypt, the empire that squished them, and it's the word Mitzrayim. That when we try to control and manage the chaos, we just amplify the waves. We just push them around and we end up squished. It gets hard to breathe. We also, though, talked about responses that are different in the storms. in the waves, how there are people who choose to walk with God in the storms, and then there is some buoyancy. There's some solid places. There's ways of bringing life to others and converting the chaos into new creation. The story of Noah walking with God and then buoyant in the ark. The story of Moses' mother, who creates the reed basket and sends him forth on the Nile River, the water, a symbol of the chaos, but he's buoyant in her trust. The people Israel we had last week, who the Egyptian army is advancing, there's the Red Sea. And as they are still and listen for God and move with God, they make their way through. We see in the story of Jesus, there are the waves of chaos. The ultimate expression is death. And yet, as Jesus entrusts himself to God, the story is saying that those death waters part. The chaos moves aside in ways, and there's still new possibilities for resurrection and new life. Even as we know some of those stories, even as we may at times believe them, it's hard when things are overwhelming. And it's easier to fall back on trying to manage the chaos, trying to push it around, living in the anxiety and the storms. And so today we have reminders before us of God's intention, the gift of people who share imagination and vision of the reign of God at work in the world, even in the midst of the hard times. We have this picture with the prophet Isaiah. He's speaking to Israel in a time where it's not Egypt, but it's still Mitzrayim, the word for Egypt, the squeezing, the squishing. This time it's the Babylonian Empire. That empire had attacked Judea, destroyed the temple, leveled Jerusalem, burned the countryside. Some people fled into Egypt. Many people died. There was a community living in exile, away from home, away from what was familiar, away from one another. And that's probably for many of us a familiar feeling for different reasons at this time. And a lot of people in those times and places, they're asking, where is God? Are we alone? Does God hate us? Is God gone? Are we being punished? But Isaiah, as Isaiah listens for how God is still speaking, Isaiah hears God say, no, that's not it. And is offered a vision that Isaiah shares with the people. Excuse me. The vision is first of a stump. Stumps are ugly, right? Stumps, you see stumps around, that is a symbol of not life. That's a symbol of it's gone. But the vision is of a green shoot coming out of the stump. That even in what seems hopeless and empty, when there is trust and inviting in, new life can shoot up. There's possibilities. If just a remnant, the passage says, will listen and move with God, even in what seems like devastation and emptiness, new life, new possibilities come forward. And then there's this picture that's a contrast to the flood of chaos from the Noah story, as that continues with, if you just have a little bit, the little shoot, then eventually the world is flooded with knowledge of God, with justice and mercy and love. That's the vision Isaiah shares. Jesus, in his parables, shares visions and images of the reign of God to people who are struggling, people who feel impoverished and hopeless under an oppressive Roman Empire. And he gives them images and pictures of the reign of God is like a little bit of yeast that can leaven a whole big batch of dough, and you get wonderful bread. Or that the reign of God is like a little mustard seed, and it seems so insignificant, and yet it grows and birds nest, and then the birds excrete mustard seeds all over the field, and it takes over everything. That the reign of God, it can seem small and insignificant. It's that remnant idea. But if just a few trust, a few listen, there's possibilities for life spreading. And in the passage you heard today, Jesus compares the reign of God with a great banquet. Most likely what's in mind is a wedding party. And in the ancient world, the weddings were the biggest celebration. This was not a 3-hour reception with open bar. This went on all week long. And often, a whole village would be present. And we see how the invitation goes out. There's the first level, the people who should know better, the people who should be the ones who want to be part of the celebration, and they have excuses and they don't want to get in on it. But then how the invitation, the circle just keeps going wider and wider and wider. That the reign of God is for everybody and anybody. It's expansive and big and inclusive. Not afraid and shutting people out. The reign of God speaks against things like calling this a Chinese virus. It is not. But those kind of words create scapegoats and enemies. The reign of God doesn't do that. And then we have this image from the book of Revelation. And I apologize because some of you have been traumatized by this book or ways it's been taught to you, where there are certain kind of Christian groups that weaponize parts of the Bible, including this book especially. But it's helpful to know, to me, that the book of Revelation comes from a person who, for different reasons than you and I right now in places of isolation, but he's isolated. He is in exile on an island. The powers that be, they hoped they could stop this Jesus movement by taking the leaders and making them go live somewhere else. But still, he knows the isolation. He knows what it's like to be disconnected. But in that space and time of removal from regular life, we hear that he's in meditation on the Sabbath, on the Lord's Day. So he takes time to listen for God in that isolating space. And the book of Revelation, he didn't have email or Zoom, but he sends what he receives out and stays connected with the community in Asia Minor. And in the vision that he has, in this place of hopelessness and isolation, the vision that he has is not of, many of us learned Revelation this way, how God's going to take the good people up to a faraway place, sort of God's done with this world and we have an escape plan. But if you heard the vision that was just read by Pastor John, the picture is God making God's home with us, that the New Jerusalem descending, being in this world, God with us, wiping away the tears from our eyes. That these are the reminders, the visions of those who've come before us, who've been in very hard places. And it's not about denying what's hard or difficult or chaotic or stormy. It's about reminders not to just be centered there. Yes, be aware of the risks and the dangers, but when we're constantly in the flow of that, then what we tend to do is just churn up the waves. And we're being reminded today to be centered also, to pay attention to the vision, the possibilities, how God can be at work. I invite you to consider ways that we've seen the reign of God at hand in more contemporary times. I think of images of African American folk linked arm in arm with also allies in the face of fire hoses and attack dogs during the civil rights movement that brought forth transformation. I think of during the Arab Spring when there were Muslim groups in Egypt, Mitzrayim, who were under attack, and how as they were bowing for worship, there were Coptic Christians that created a circle around the Muslim worshipers to protect them from the Egyptian army. I think of simple things right now, where there are businesses that are creating special hours for people who are having a hard time getting their supplies to come in and not have to engage the pushing and shoving of the crowds. I think of the words of sociologist and Christian Margaret Mead, where she talked about how never underestimate the power of a small group of thoughtful people to change the world. She says that's the only thing that ever has. That there's this idea of even a remnant, even a few of us who tune in, who connect, then there are not just stumps, but green shoots coming up, mustard seeds, little bits of leaven, that we can offer what is celebrative and good and beautiful. And I know Casas Adobis, in the sense of the wider world and community, we feel pretty small. And probably in our own homes, we might even feel smaller. And so we need to be reminded that who we are and what we have to offer in connection with God is not just life-giving for us, but we can be in this season those who center in God's vision of hope and light and life, and from where we are and as much as we can, be hope and light and life in the world. And that's good news when we live it. Amen.